Hi, I'm Brooke Watson. I'm a data scientist at the ACLU. For those of you who don't know what the ACLU is, ACLU stands for the American Civil Liberties Union, and we are an organization that works to protect and expand civil rights and civil liberties in America, primarily through advocacy and litigation. And so I'm going to be talking about some ways that we use R to support our immigrants' rights project in service of that goal. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about 10 functions that I have learned about recently or started using in new ways that I have used in different projects. Some of these are from lesser known packages that I hope that you will learn about and incorporate into your own workflows. Some of them are from sort of our core tidyverse packages that we all know and love, but hopefully there's a little bit of something for everybody. So I'm going to be talking about this in the context of 3 different immigration cases that the ACLU has taken in the past few years. Demus versus Nielsen, Hernandez V Sessions, and Mrs. L v Ice. The packages that I'm going to be talking about, Tabulizer and DAF, ReadR, and VizDat and ggplot2. And so Tabulizer is really useful for extracting data from raw PDFs, and DAF helps you look at changes in data over time, so you can look at your data. We've all used ReadR, I suspect, but that when paired with VizDat can help us look at our data. And then once we have imported all our data, we can use ggplot to look at our data. Really briefly, because we have 10 functions, so we've got to keep it moving, here are the ones that we're going to be talking about. So, to start, Demus v. Nielsen is a class action lawsuit that challenges the arbitrary detention of asylum seekers. So just to start from scratch, the Constitution affords all people in the United States the right to due process and equal protection under the law, and that includes immigrants, and that includes asylum seekers. So this means that you can't be detained indefinitely without a parole hearing. Immigration cases tend to take a long time, and so what usually happens is individuals get parole hearings to determine whether they can be released from detention while they're awaiting their case. And so in early of 2017, we noticed that 5 ICE field offices almost entirely stopped giving parole interviews and granting parole determinations, which means that people were locked up indefinitely. And so in the middle of the summer last year, the judge ruled that ICE has to give parole interviews and determinations to all of those class members in a timely manner. And they have to report the results of those determinations to our team so that we can make sure that they're following their own policy directive. And so the data question in this challenge is, do the statistics that they're reporting in their monthly reports actually match the raw data that they're sending us? And can we take that analysis one step further and see if there is any evidence that people are being detained arbitrarily? So we use Tabulizer and DAF to do this. In Tabulizer, the real workhorse is this function extract tables that is sort of magically pulls tables from PDF. And we can use locate areas interactively to find out the locations of the columns that we want to pull out, and get end pages is just really useful if you want to incorporate the other 2 into a function. And so locate areas, I think, really needs to be done interactively through some live coding, but I am a coward, so we're going to watch this GIF. And so as you can see, locate areas, you read in the name of the PDF, and you can draw boxes around the table or the column that you want, and it'll show you the coordinates of that table. And so we can use that to find the coordinates, these numbers right here. This is sort of a simplified version of a function that we use to get the number of pages in a PDF, extract all the tables, and sort of bind them into a list column. And we can do that every month, and we can use that with across all of the 5 different field offices month over month. But sometimes we want to maintain a healthy skepticism about the data that we receive from our opposition in a lawsuit. And so sometimes rerunning an R markdown the next month on new data can provide erroneous results, even if it doesn't throw any errors. And so sometimes we want to look at the changes between those 2 data sets. And DAF is amazing. It's essentially a diff for data. And so what that looks like, again, another coward's demo. You create this object called you create this DAF object, and then you can render it in HTML, and you get a colorized version of the changes that are happening between. So this is iris data, and it shows you the rows that are modified and the rows and columns that are added or deleted, which is extremely useful. So for example, we can run that pipe from before on a data set, save it to something like an RDS, and then run it on new data and compare the changes. And what we found, this is fake data, but what we found was that we had some strange discrepancies that weren't being caught by any sort of error handling, because in this example, as you can see, we have dates that are sort of in the teens that are mutated to be 10 days earlier. And what was happening was that ones weren't showing up in the PDF data if they came right after a backslash, because they got dropped by whatever haunted computer program that I can only imagine that the El Paso ICE field office uses. But anyways, we were getting these like really malformed data sets, and just looking at it in this colorized way helped us understand how we could go back to the government and say, what is going on? We need to fix this. So the second case is Hernandez V Sessions, and this is another case about whether it's constitutional to detain people for a certain amount of time. But this is about the ability to pay. So again, immigration and asylum cases can take years. And so in the parole hearing process, when judges determine whether someone can be released from detention until their ultimate decision about whether they are granted asylum in the US, they will sometimes be released ROR'd, and sometimes they will be required to pay a bond. And so what happens when you are an immigrant or when you're fleeing asylum from your home country is that you may not have thousands of dollars to pay a bond. We had one individual who was detained by ICE agents, was granted parole, so a judge said, you're free to go, you're low risk, you're going to come back to your hearings because you have a strong asylum claim. But they gave him a $3,000 bond, and so he was detained for 4 years after a judge said, you can go until we adjudicate your case, just because he couldn't pay that $3,000. And so when you do this, you set up a system in which people go to jail because they are poor, or they stay in jail because they are poor. And that's unconstitutional. And the judge ruled that this is little more than punishing a person for their poverty. So what we had to do in this case was look at administrative records. So this case has been adjudicated long before the ACLU even had an analytics team. But this is still a real problem, and there are still thousands of people who are detained after they receive a bond hearing, or after they receive a bond because they can't pay it. And so we want to use administrative data from the Executive Office of Immigration Review, or EOR, to review this. And so originally this data was obtained through FOIA requests, but there's actually a great component to the, or Freedom of Information Act. There's a great provision of the Freedom of Information Act called the Beetlejuice provision. I don't know if you're familiar with Beetlejuice, but when you say his name 3 times, he appears. And when you FOIA for the same data 3 times in a row, when 3 separate parties FOIA for the same data, the government is required to put that somewhere online, accessible. So that has happened with EOR data, and so now all of this immigration court data is publicly available and hosted on the Justice Department's website. But it's really messy and really hard to work with, and requires not only a lot of data cleaning knowledge, but a lot of nuance and understanding of the immigration system and immigration law. One component of working with this really messy data is that we had tab-separated data saved as a CSV that, when we read in, would often jump a line. So you would have one observation that for some reason just cut off at the end and skipped and put information in the next line. We'll look at what that looks like in a little bit. And so readr, as I am sure we've all used, is useful for reading and writing many different file types. And VizDat is a package that is really useful in my life to look at data types and missingness. And so here are some of the functions that we used in that. Vismiss is my favorite. And read file and write file are 2 functions that I had never had the misfortune to need. In my workflow, I'm typically reading CSVs and TSVs and other file types, but it can be really useful to be able to work with that super raw data. So here's an example of 50 rows of observations, and as you can see, there are some columns where we have a lot of missingness, and then there is one row where things kind of get thrown off, a row and a half. And this very first variable is the ID, and so that's something that we really need, but we can tell there's something going on here. I'll cut to the chase about the hours of time that we spent just looking in a text editor at this raw information, trying to figure out what was happening for the world's most boring live coding ever. But jump to the solution, which was that we removed carriage. We had a bunch of extra carriage returns that were just in the data for no reason. This, I will say, is not probably a replicable solution for all of your problems. It's probably not a great idea to always just remove all of the carriage returns in a data set. But in this case, it worked. And so as you can see, if we go back, we can see that missingness has gone away. And viz-miss is really useful in the sort of exploratory phase of a data analysis when you're trying to understand where the missingness is. And it can be useful as a gut check. And so finally, I want to talk about some progress that's being made in the Miss L versus ICE case, which many of you may know as the family separation case. So I spoke about this in January at our studio, and this is what we knew. This is a slide I presented in January. We started litigating the case in February after learning that in November of 2017, an immigrant and her 6-year-old, or an asylum seeker and her 6-year-old daughter were separated after being detained at the border. And I started working on the project in June, and we were still working on reunifying the children that had been separated. But in June of 2018, the judge in the case filed an injunction saying you can't separate any more children, you can't do this anymore. This was at the same time that President Trump issued an executive order saying essentially the same thing. So family separations were supposed to have stopped in June of 2018. And this is the timeline that we know about now. So we know that separations were occurring much earlier than November of 2017, and even much earlier than this case sort of became really talked about and known in the media. It's almost a year in advance of that ruling, right? And so we both know that these cases were happening much earlier than we thought, and we know that they've been happening since the injunction. Now, I will say the government says that there are certain exclusions that that make a separation okay in their mind. So, for example, if the parent has a communicable disease, or if they have a really serious criminal record, there are reasons they say that they are allowed to separate a parent from their children. However, we've seen criminal exclusions be something as simple as a parking ticket, or as the crime of entering the United States. So, and I also want to caveat everything I'm saying with the fact that the government has admitted that they don't know how many families have been separated. And so the data that we're analyzing in this case are the records that they're required to report to us, but it's definitely an undercount. So the functions that we're using in this project, or the two that I'm going to talk about today, are really helpful in our understanding of how the new separations are different from the original ones, and what's going on sort of over time. And I'm going to talk about two functions that I have learned about recently, or that I've started using in different ways, and that I think can be somewhat misunderstood. So Cdf Plots, if you are familiar with them, are essentially a complement to histograms that show cumulative distribution of sort of on a timeline. And it's really useful when our histograms are really susceptible to binning effects. So we know that sometimes a histogram can look a certain way, but not actually but be kind of a misleading plot. And so that's useful to use those two in tandem. And then kernel density plots are also sort of a histogram or bar chart complement. And they, in this case, are really useful if we're comparing the proportional makeup of two differently sized groups. And so I'll go back to that timeline. But if we look at it on an ECDF, this is what it looks like. So if we're looking at the cumulative distribution, or the sort of running timeline along the bottom of the date of separation, that red line is the date of the federal injunction. And as you can see, it spikes. The known separations spike around last summer, and they sort of continue. There's never really a leveling off after that, after last summer. And they're continuing, and there's some hints that it might be on the rise. This data is already old as of yesterday. And so anyways, that's the function. This is what those three plots might look like together. And so this can just give you a sort of a more well-rounded view. In this case, the histograms are not so bad. They give us a pretty decent picture, no matter how many bins we use, a pretty decent picture of the pattern. But sometimes this effect is stronger than others, and so this can be a really useful secondary way of looking at our data. Another case in which we can use two different functions really quickly to get a quick look at our data is in looking at the geom density function. So in the graph on the left, the big trend that jumps out is that so what we have on the x-axis is age, and along the y-axis is the number of children who are separated of each age. And it looks like the children are sort of more likely to be older. There's not really a lot of kids who are under 5, according to the left graph. And you can sort of see the difference between the red and the blue. The red colors are the separations that occurred before June 28th, and the blue are the separations that occurred after June 28th. But when you look at geom density, again, when you're just sort of exploring your data, the thing that jumps out to me is how much of that space between 0 and 5 is covered by the blue, the new separations. And so this is something that I think is kind of hard to pick up on in the graph on the left. If you're looking for it, you might find it. But one of the things that we're trying to do with exploratory data analysis is find things that maybe we weren't looking for. And so the long story short of this, and again, we can sort of take the best of both worlds of those two functions and look at the distribution of age over time and compare the new separations to the old separations. Here's some code that does that. The long story short of this is that under 4% of the original separations were of children under 5 years old, and more than a fifth of the separations that have happened since June 28th, that should say 2018, are under 5. And so this is still an extremely difficult problem that's going on. It's not something that we even know the scale of, but looking at the data that we do have can help us sort of raise awareness and raise this issue. So I think the thing that I hope you take away is that looking at data in different ways can sort of deepen your understanding of a problem and help you look for different kinds of solutions, or at least surface issues that you may not have recognized. Again, here are the tools that we used today. If you have annoying data that is tab separated, if you have annoying data that's stored in PDFs, if you have things that change over time that you don't really trust, or if you just want to look at plots in different ways, hopefully these are useful. So thank you so much. I want to say thank you to everybody who supports the ACLU and all of the amazing, very, very, very busy immigration lawyers that I've been working with. I know there are a lot of sort of ACLU members in the audience, so thank you.